Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here this afternoon. I'm with Allan Davidson, and Allan, during this lockdown period, has been working hard on St. Luke's history. And so I wanted to ask you how it's going, Allan.
Well, thank you, Glenn. Well, I've been making slow progress, although I've been working on this history fairly intensively since the beginning of last year. And it's got an interesting story. The history of St. Luke's really hasn't ever been fully told. There were short, brief histories that were written for the first Jubilee, 50th Jubilee, and then the 75th Jubilee. And then the promised centenary history and the promised 125th history were never delivered. And in in the year 2000, I agreed that I would take on this task. Here I am 20 years later, and I still haven't delivered it. So last year I made it my sort of mission to really get on with the history. St. Luke's, I think, has an absolutely fascinating history. They say that all parishes are interesting and some are more interesting than others. And St. Luke's is one of those more interesting than other parishes. It was established in 1875 and its first minister came in 1877, and he was there until he retired in 1918. That was the Reverend G.B. Monroe. He was a Scotsman. He came with very strong evangelical, revivalist kind of interests. He was quite ecumenical for his day, working closely with Baptists and Methodists who shared similar evangelical outlooks. And together with his wife, Agnes, who was known, of course, in the day as Mrs. G.B. Monroe, not Agnes Monroe, they really had a significant impact on the lives of people at that time. They were very involved in establishing work among young people, particularly the Band of Hope, and then the Christian Endeavour movement. Both of them had very strong temperance prohibition elements. And then in the 20th century, they became very involved in the work with the Bible class. The Presbyterian Bible class movement became a very strong feature throughout the national church. And both Mr. and Mrs. Monroe were involved in that, along with other leaders that they had. But one of the things I'm interested in tracing out with the history of St. Luke's is what David Clarke referred to as the continuum of St. Luke's, the way in which one generation or one group of leaders is replaced by another group of leaders. And so you have this chain over the nearly, 145 years that we've now had of St. Luke's history. And a question for me is, how does St. Luke's, which had this very strong evangelical, revivalist kind of approach of its minister and its parish in its early years, how does that over time move to become the liberal and then progressive church that we know today? And so I want to just speak very briefly a little bit about some of the ministers who have helped make that shift, although recognizing that the ministers also always work closely with people. And the story of St. Luke's is one that involves not only the minister and his wife, but of course all the people. The second minister who came, Cecil Tocker, only stayed for a very short time, only about 6 years. And that's not unusual for long ministries to be followed by a short ministry. There's some difficulty, some adjustment that the people in the parish have to make to the new minister, and they seem always want to compare the new minister with the old minister. Tocker also was somebody who had quite strong ecumenical interests and was really instrumental in forming a group called the Council for Christian Congregations in Auckland. It had quite a strong social justice dimension. It was concerned, for example, about the accessibility to housing. And I think that some of the people at St. Luke's were a little bit uncomfortable with the more radical edge that Tocker brought. He was followed by James Thompson. Thompson had served in the ambulance corps during the First World War and then was transferred over to the chaplaincy department. And he came to St. Luke's with a strong reputation about working with young people, and particularly with the Bible class. He was the national president of the Young Men's Bible class during his time at St. Luke's, and that was a particular feature of his ministry. He was followed by Bob McDowell. He came in 1938. He came from Dunedin, where he had a very successful ministry. He was the first graduate ministry to come to St. Luke's. He had an honours degree in philosophy, had great competence in Greek. He had finished his training studying in Scotland. His ministry, though, was interrupted by the Second World War. He became a chaplain to the forces in the 1940s, in 1940, and he went to North Africa, where he was captured at Sidi Rezegh in 1941, and then spent 3.5 years in prisoner of war camps in Italy and Germany. And he saw things there that I think had a huge impact on the rest of his life. There was a large Russian prisoner of war camp next to the one he was in, and he saw many of them dying from hunger. He was close to Dresden, where he saw the bombing that took place, the obliteration virtually of Dresden. And at the end of the war, he was involved in helping minister to some of the victims of Belsen concentration camp. And so he saw things which were really things that he didn't talk about much. But his daughter Mary, many years later, wrote a thesis about her father, drawing on his war diaries. And that's been extremely helpful in trying to understand both Bob McDowell before the war and after the war. The way that he was fairly moralistic, Sabbatarian almost, before the war, and the way that he was much broader in his acceptance of people after the war. He had a great interest in overseas mission and became convener of the Overseas Missions Committee and put a huge amount of effort into that. But one of the things that's noted by the session minutes at one stage towards the end of his ministry is that he is unwell. He has developed Parkinson's, and there's a concern about how far the war has impacted on him. And so he takes early retirement in 1960. He's replaced by Norman Gilkison, and Norman had been part of the student Christian movement. He had been actually their national officer, their worker at one stage. And so he came with quite liberal credentials and interests, and he helped move the parish some way along the line of accepting a more liberal and open attitude. And that was seen particularly in the work that he did around the heresy trial of Lloyd Gearing in 1967 in the congregation. He also was very involved in ecumenical affairs. Church union was very much discussed at that time. And you have the bringing together of St. Luke's with Knox Parish in Parnell as part of that whole move towards working together. He was followed briefly by Don Glennie. Don Glennie was only at St. Luke's for a couple of years when he was appointed as Professor of Pastoral Theology down in Dunedin. He was succeeded by Alan Quigley, who had been principal of Pacific Theological College. And one of the things that Alan noted when he came to St. Luke's was just how Pākehā or Pālangi St. Luke's was. And he brought something of his background of working with peoples of different countries and different cultures to St. Luke's, which came as something, I think, as a shock to some of the St. Luke's people. But he had a huge following because of his very, very successful preaching. He was a New Testament scholar. He had postgraduate qualifications from St. Andrews in that area, and he continued that liberal influence. But one of his greatest legacies was his vision for establishing links between St. Luke's and the community. And he was really one of the driving forces that led to the establishment of the community centre and the appointment of the community worker, what became the community director. And his work with people like John Irwin in particular was significant in that area. And then we come to David Clark. And David's ministry in many ways was given national prominence by the way that he came out as a gay man at the 1990 Invercargill Assembly and confronted the church with the whole issue of how do you include people of different sexual preferences. And while that became a large issue for St. Luke's, he found in St. Luke's that he was loved, he was accepted, and St. Luke's became very much an inclusive, a reconciling congregation, and it also made further progress along that journey of becoming more liberal. You had the visits of people like John Spong and John Dominic Crossan and Fung and others that David embraced. And there was a very strong liberal dimension by this stage at St. Luke's that then merged into the progressive congregation that we know today. Well, there's a lot more to St. Luke's than just the ministers, of course. There's the work amongst young people, the Bible class and Sunday school. There's the work amongst women, the PWMU and the Ladies Guild. There's the choir and the singing and the organ playing. There are the buildings. There are the centre. There's the centre that's played such a large part in its life. And there are the great legacies which I think St Luke's has helped contribute to. Things like the Leslie Centre, which emerged out of the Leslie Orphanage. The Elizabeth Knox Home, both of these came from benefactors who were connected with St Luke's. The Dingwall Trust, and then more recently things like restorative justice and the Aotearoa Development Cooperative. There's a lot of fascinating stories in the history of St Luke's, and I'm enjoying finding out about those and telling them, and I would be very open for you to ask questions, to share with me some of your own insights and understandings. If you've got photographs, I'd be very interested to have them. So thanks for this opportunity, Glenn, for me to share some of these things. You no doubt will hear more from me in future days.
Thank you, Allan, and thank you for all the time and energy and hard work you're putting into this very important project for us. Thank you.
You're welcome.